Good afternoon and welcome to Craft in the Real World. I'm gonna turn your audios off for the time being. And there we go. Sorry about that. Welcome to Craft in the Real World, a conversation with Matthew Salasis, hosted by Watershed Lit as part of the 2022 Virginia Festival of the Book, a program of Virginia Humanities. This annual spring tradition is actually being met today with some winter snow here in the Commonwealth. So if you're in Virginia, I hope you're warm and safe inside. I'm Greg Wilhelm, Director of Mason Creative Writing at George Mason University and co-founder of Watershed Lit, Center for Literary Engagement and Publishing Practice at Mason. And thanks for joining us today. This event is one in a series of 6 devoted to Virginia writing and publishing, presented by writing centers and organizations across Virginia, including 1455 Literary Arts, James River Writers, the Muse Writers Center, Randolph College MFA program, and Watershed Lit Center for Literary Engagement and Publishing Practice, as well as WriterHouse. The full series of Virginia writing and publishing events are available at vabook.org, where you can also explore the full festival schedule and watch past events. While you're there, please consider making a donation to support the festival's ongoing work at vabook.org/give. Closed captions are available at any time during this event by clicking on the closed caption button below. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Matthew Salasis is author of Craft in the Real World, an Esquire Best Book of 2021, 3 novels, and a forthcoming essay collection. He has taught at Coe College, the Ashland MFA program, the Tin House and Kundeman summer workshops, and writing centers like Grub Street and Imprint. He has edited fiction for Gulf Coast, Redivider, and the Good Men Project, and has written about craft and creative writing workshops for venues like NPR's Code Switch, The Millions, and Electric Literature. Helon Habila is a Nigerian-American author who has published 4 novels, including his latest widely acclaimed novel, Travelers. He is the editor of the Granta Book of African Short Stories and teaches creative writing at George Mason University. Thank you all for joining us today. Matthew, Helon, it's all yours. And allow me a second to bring up your audio. That sounds like it's coming from you. There, that's much better.
Is it? Okay. Not sure. Is it?
I think if one of you mute, maybe.
Huh.
Greg, probably if you're skipping out.
I don't know.
No, I'm muted, so
Oh.
wherever the feedback is.
Is it from me?
Okay. Your end, I think, Helon. That's good. Try it now.
Is it?
Well, I'm gonna try to kick you out of this room if I can, and then bring you back.
Is it okay now?
It's much better now.
Okay. I think I had 2 windows open.
Oh yeah, that might have been it. There you go. Okay, good job. Thanks.
Okay, sorry about that, Matthew. Sorry.
No worries.
Yeah. Really good to see you.
You too.
Yeah. I was telling you, I just really enjoyed your book, and thank you so much for writing it. I think a lot of creative writing students, creative writing teachers are going to find this, very thought-provoking. It made me, look at the current model of our workshops and how we teach creative writing, in a new light. And I believe that's the reason why you wrote it in the first place. Can you give us a little description about, what inspired you to write the book and what the book is about. And if you, I don't know if you want to do a little reading from it.
Yeah, sure. I guess I can. I think I have it somewhere. Sorry, I didn't realize I was reading from it.
Oh, you don't have to. If you want to, that would be good.
Sure. So the book is an argument for craft as a set of expectations, which is to say, we read a lot of books and we learn from those books certain moves that we can make to please a readership that has also read those books, right? And so everything from picking a book and turning it from left to right, which is different when you're in other countries, right? Is just an expectation about how to read something. And I started writing the book. I guess I started just wishing that we could do better in our classrooms, I guess, and even have a conversation about it a while ago. Maybe, I don't know. It was a long time ago. But I've been writing about it, about craft and pedagogy in various places, as was listed in the bio, and then for a while on the Pleiades website, where I was website editor for a while. So I'll just read a little bit right from the beginning here, just so you get a sense of it. The start is, this book is a challenge to accepted models of craft and workshop, to everything from a character-driven plot to the cone of silence, or gag rule, that in a creative writing workshop silences the manuscript's author. And the challenge is this: to take craft out of some imaginary vacuum, as if meaning in fiction is separate from meaning in life, and return it to its cultural and historical context. Race, gender, sexuality, etc. affect our lives and so must affect our fiction. Real-world context, and particularly what we do with that context, is craft. Over a decade ago, I sat silently in an MFA workshop while mostly white writers discussed my race. I decided not to name the race of any character, my story, Asian American or otherwise, but the workshop demanded that the story inform the reader, quote unquote, if my characters were like me, people of color. Common assumption lies behind this, that no mention of race is supposed to mean a character is white. I didn't have to ask why the white writers in the room never identified the race of their white characters. I already knew why. They believed white is literature's default. I just couldn't say so. To name or not name a character's race is a matter of craft. To consider a character to be white, unless stated otherwise, is a matter of craft. And since this is a craft book, let's explore exactly what is at stake for the craft of fiction here. There are three possibilities. One, if fiction dictates that a writer identify only the race of non-white characters, then craft is a tool used to normalize whiteness. Two, if race is a factor only in stories with characters of color, then craft must be different for fiction with characters of color than it is for fiction with white characters. And three, otherwise, if any mention of race affects the story, then, like setting, race should be a part of any craft discussion. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So I like the way the book is structured. You have the first section, craft in the real world, and the second section, part 2, workshop in the real world. And it's so exhaustive. And though I know you say that it's not supposed to be definitive, it's just a kind of a conversation starter, but it has, it touches on basically almost every aspect of the workshop and storytelling. And it has sample syllabi from different writers that from different teachers that you found useful, and lots of examples from books and storytelling traditions and all of that. Do you think that there is essentially that stories are based on their context, their cultural context, their background, all of that? Does it mean there's no essentially a bad story or a good story, but it depends on how you approach the story and whose story it is and who's telling the story?
Yeah, I think like a literary critic would probably say, right, that the reader gets to decide what's a good story or a bad story. And that to me says something about, right, the expectations that a reader has about what a good story or a bad story is, right, and whether or not it satisfies those expectations. So like I have a certain kind of taste in stories, and you probably have something similar or somewhat different. And my daughter has a certain taste in stories, and um, she'll say like, this is a really good book, and I'll think, I don't know if I would agree with that. And sometimes she'll say, this is a really good book, and I'll think, I really liked it too. That's weird. It's interesting that like both of us can get some satisfaction here. So it's not that there isn't any kind of good or bad, right? It's just that the ways that we evaluate fiction is based on what we think fiction is supposed to be, or what we think at least is like pleasurable, right, in fiction.
That's right. I also really love the point you made about telling stories and retelling stories, that we learn, especially children, learn from stories that they know already. It's the stories that they don't know, are the ones that they cannot learn from. But the stories that they learn the most from are the stories that they hear over and over again. Can you explain a little bit more?
Yeah, so studies show, like one of the reasons probably any parent knows the child will really like to just kind of read exactly the same book over and over again for a long period of time, which I think can be kind of frustrating to adults. It was for me, at least, thinking like, oh man, I wish I could read something else tonight. But they get a lot of pleasure out of it. One, it like validates their predictions, right? They're able to kind of predict what will happen, and then they have some kind of feeling of power, right? When that comes true, they know what's going to happen. And then because they know what's going to happen, they're able to pay attention to other things in the story, right? They have some sense. I think this is pretty much how it works in general, right? Like as we have a better sense of what a kind of story shape is, then we can pay more attention to characters or sentence level things that interest us, or for kids, pictures or other things in the book, which they're learning from on the side, or not on the side, but with the foundation of already kind of feeling grounded in an understanding of what the story will be. And there's some third thing that they're getting from this too, but I'm forgetting what it is right now. But so it goes to show you, right? Like, I think this happens for all of us. We like to read stories that kind of fulfill our expectations of what a story will be, and we tend to learn a lot from those stories just because we're able to kind of look beyond the expectations of what the story is to the things that we can learn from other parts of the text. And often when we read something that is very different from our expectations or our background in reading, it, like our first focus is like, wow, this is so different. And it takes, we're probably noticing the difference mostly, and we probably haven't gotten to see a lot of the details. And then if you kind of apply that, right, to criticism, you can see why sometimes when critics read something that's different from what they're used to, their focus then becomes on how it's different from what they're used to, rather than like on what the author is trying to do and what else is in the book, the way that they could do if they were reading something that they were more used to.
Exactly. And which is very important, to understand where the author is coming from. And this is one point that you kind of kept coming back to in the book. You are especially against the gag rule or the cone of silence in the workshop. You it's that's a very interesting point, especially going back to the Iowa model of creative writing, and you do kind of historicize the workshop model going back all the way to 1930s, the Iowa model, and why it was easy to have that gag rule, because it was all the same kind of people from the same background, white, male, cis, able-bodied, Christian, and they all have the same understanding of culture, and the story basically, they can understand where the story is coming from.
Yeah.
But the gag rule doesn't work very well if you are different from them, which is basically, the more multicultural we become, the harder it is to justify this gag rule.
Absolutely, yeah. So I try to think theoretically what would be the reason for the gag rule. And it does seem to me like it makes some sense if you've got 11 people in the room other than yourself who like share your understanding of story and are like ideal readers for the story. And that could happen if you all have that similar background. But then right now we're not like that, and the people who suffer the most, right, are the people who can't kind of talk about what they're doing on the page, and readers without any context for that are just, of course, going to read it from whatever they're bringing themselves, right, whatever their own reading background is. And so I kind of argue for just more context. I think, one of the great things about workshop is we're getting to see the author's process. It's something we don't usually get to see in other courses, and yet, like, the gag rule, like, takes that away from, like, takes one of those main advantages of workshop away from us.
Yeah, but I don't know if you've gotten feedback from people about that. Because the one problem, I guess, that people might point out is, what if we're all allowed to speak in the workshop? Wouldn't it be chaos? I know some writers can get very defensive when you allow them to speak or to defend their stories. They cannot stop speaking.
Yeah, that's usually the first thing people say, right? Like, don't they get defensive? And I experienced that too in the MFA, like people not being able to speak for 30 minutes, and then at the end they've got their like 3 minutes to talk, and they try to defend themselves, right? But it's maybe not surprising, but to think that when writers don't feel attacked, right, when they feel like they're part of the process, then they don't actually feel defensive because there's no reason for them to feel defensive. So in my experience, writers have never tried to defend themselves in a workshop where they have more control, because they never feel like they have to defend themselves, right? Because they're kind of guiding what's happening and what they get to talk about.
And you have these models, the workshop models one of them that I really like is the critical response process. And the modified version of it that you say you've used often in your workshops. Can you explain a little bit about it?
Yeah, so CRP is a model created by Liz Lerman, who's a performance artist, dance artist, something like that. And it's mainly for performance, or started out as for performance art. It's now kind of crossed into writing workshops. And it consists of 4 stages. And she says she was thinking through why she listened to some feedback and why she felt defensive versus other feedback. And so the stages are meant to set up a kind of level of trust that helps the creator to feel like they can listen better to the feedback. And so the first step is statements of meaning, which is kind of observations about what's going on, what's interesting, exciting. And then the second step is the author as questioner, or the creator as questioner, the artist as questioner, where the artist asks things that are on their mind and guides the conversation around things they want help with. And then the third step is questions, neutral questions from the audience, which means people can't ask questions that are kind of like couched, right? Criticism couched in a question. They have to ask questions that they don't know the answer to, which then helps the artist to kind of think through these questions on their own. And then the last stage is opinion time. And one of the things I really like about Lerman's opinion time, other than like the title opinion time, which is funny, is they have to ask for permissions. They have to say, I have an opinion about, I don't know, the way the dancer moves in, around the 1 minute mark or something. And the creator can say, I would love to hear that, or like, actually, I feel okay with that, and I don't need suggestions there, right? And there's no kind of hard feelings there. It just allows for the feedback to be productive for the artist primarily, right? Rather than, which is often the case, or maybe always the case, and useful for the person giving the feedback, just kind of switching it around. So when I do a kind of modified version of that, it starts with describing the story, where we, kind of also talk about what kind of story it is, what stands out in the story, who the audience is for the story. And then the author will ask some kinds of questions, respond to what we've just said, ask questions to start the conversation going. And then we'll kind of do this like conversational back and forth. I think like the thing that I felt was limiting about CRP is how strict the stages are. You have to like do one stage, only only the things that are allowed in that stage, and then move on to the next stage and do only the things that are allowed in that stage. You can't kind of cross over. And I actually think we gain a lot from a kind of more conversational mode. And so it helps in my classes, I think, for people to be able to ask questions back and forth, right? We'll ask questions, the author will ask questions, and it'll kind of be more of a conversation. And then lastly, we ask the author to say what they'll do in revision, right? So you kind of give some responsibility and some sort of direction to the next step of the process. And in the middle there, we do a lot of different things, kind of post description. We usually have a kind of description and author questions, and then I'll kind of work in whatever seems to be helpful to the conversation we're having and helpful to the author, depending on how they've expressed their kind of attitude toward workshop and to the story that we've read.
And this is all part of centering or recentering the author, like you described it, because we are taught to always kind of decenter the author and assume that the author is always not there.
Right.
I like the example you gave that, we said that, the author, even though the author is still is sitting right there next to us,
right.
and we know her or him, we don't even call their names. That's the way we've been kind of taught to think about, the author is dead, as it were.
right. It's so rude, isn't it? I just think it's just like if somebody did that in real life, it would be so rude.
Yeah. But let's talk about ideology. When you trace the history of the creative writing workshop, the idea was to make it appear as non-ideological.
Right.
But in real life, you say that there's nothing like that. There's even to paraphrase George Orwell, even the idea that writing shouldn't be political is political in itself.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. And the workshop, I mean, it's not even kind of hidden. If you look at the records, Paul Engel, who is the leader of the workshop for a long period of time, and the period of time in which it kind of grew the most and raised the most money, did a lot of his fundraising by making explicit those political goals, right? By saying, we're in the Cold War, we need to kind of raise a sense of American storytelling and democracy and individualism. And the best way to do that, right, is to fund these writers who can then spread that kind of gospel of America through the world. And then in the workshop itself, right, he's doing the opposite, where he's saying, we're not political at all, politics aren't allowed. And it's this way of kind of like hiding the politics behind this apolitical mask.
Mm-hmm. Story is power. Storytelling is power. And you've made that. You've given countless examples. One of the best examples that you used in the book is that of Chinua Achebe and his critique of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and how the native or African characters are silenced. And you say that cannot come from a neutral place, because craft is choice, craft is decision. Right. Conrad must have made a conscious decision to silence these characters.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we're assuming, right, like people aren't silent in real life, and so the author is making a decision about when they get to speak in the narrative. I mean, even right, it's told as a story within a story, but the storyteller, that dialogue is set off from the story itself, the way dialogue often is, and yet the people, the African characters never have a chance to speak unless it's there to kind of help the white plot move forward. So we can see then that this is something that the author could have worked against, right? And it could have been, Conrad could have, like you could see he's such a good writer, right? Like he's clearly able to do this. He could have created a narrator who had certain biases and then used the text, the authorial choices to work against that, the way we do when we have like a unreliable narrator and we have other characters say things that make it clear to us that the narrator is unreliable. And Conrad just doesn't choose to do this because he doesn't see, right, that he should, because that bias is a shared bias from narrator to author. And so I talk about, right, like the ways in which the choices within the text are this kind of authorial choices, and they can be separate or they can be used to enhance the things that the narrator and characters are doing within the text.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely that was very pertinent for me when you brought up that example, because going back into the history of African literature and how it started, and how most of the reviewers and critics of African literature were non-Africans, were white,
right,
who started the whole tradition of critiquing African writing. And they totally misunderstood where these stories were coming from. And you gave that example of how different cultures have different storytelling traditions. There's the communal, there's the individualistic traditions. And Things Fall Apart was seen as a very bad book, especially when it comes to characterization, because that this guy cannot characterize. The characters are very thin. They're not round. They are not round characters. But this is a story that's coming from a communal storytelling tradition, where you don't have to explain these characters in detail because the community knows exactly what kind of character you're talking about. So that this brings us back to the idea of audience and who you're writing for. And can you explain about that a little bit?
Yeah. I'll give you another example too. I was just doing a thesis defense and exam defense for the PhD exams, and the student was analyzing a story by an Asian American author in which it's a kind of little girl and then all of her family members. And she was saying, oh, all the family members are so well characterized, and you know everything about the family, but you know nothing about the narrator. I thought, like, but if you know all of this stuff about her family and like where she lives and her life, that seems like a lot of stuff to know about the character. But it's this kind of thinking, right? Like she has to be, you can only know her as an individual. You can't know her through other things. And another example I use in the book is this book called Tiger Writing by Gish Jen, where she talks about like her dad's writes this memoir, and it's like 2/3 about the house and the family history, and then like the last third is about the dad, and most of how he characterizes himself is this way. And so even with the criticisms against African fiction, there have kind of been similar criticisms against fiction from other parts of the world. There's this great book called Toward the Decolonization of African Literature, where the authors say, right, even if you use Forster's definition of a round character, which is like surprising in a convincing way, then that you have to understand that depends on audience, right? It's surprising to whom and convincing to whom. And so the African audience finds it surprising and convincing, then that's a round character, right? It doesn't mean like a critic from outside that context can come in and say this is not a round character just because it doesn't fit their idea of how somebody should be described, right? And so this, it's the same thing in a workshop, right? Where we think if we don't give enough context, right, the author then can have an audience reading something through this lens that isn't actually that helpful for what they're trying to do.
Yeah. So basically, Matthew, what you're calling for is like total overhauling, not just of the model, but even our idea of what stories are, how to tell stories. And you gave the example of Aristotle. When he wrote his own Poetics, that's essentially what he was doing. He was advocating for an overhauling of the way the great tragedian and comedic playwrights were writing their plays. He's saying that shouldn't be the way you should do this, because according to his observations, this and this and this are kind of better. So basically, that's what
Right.
that we should totally rethink the way we tell stories and the way we read stories and the way we critique stories.
Yeah, I guess so. I think that hopefully I'm not trying to do Aristotle's thing. He's so prescriptive, and like one of the kind of the pleasures of Aristotle, right, is how prescriptive he is, even when he's wrong. It's like
I'm not saying
it's
you're prescriptive.
so.
I know you
Yeah,
avoid
yeah.
that a lot. You're consciously avoiding that. You're not being prescriptive, definitely.
Right. I guess I'm saying we shouldn't be so quick to judge, and we should start to think like, what is the basis for our judging, right? What is the context? Why are we judging the fiction in this way? So that instead of kind of like saying like Aristotle, this is the one way to do it, and why aren't we doing it this way? I'm saying like, oh, there are many ways to do it, and maybe we should start trying to figure out those ways and keep them in mind when we're criticizing other people's work.
So I know you write a lot about people of color, and the silencing in the workshop space. I like the example you gave of how they are already silenced, in the real world. Then they're also being silenced in the workshop. It's like double silencing, which is quite interesting the way you describe it.
Yeah, it's so disempowering. I often think of I used to be a faculty assistant at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I ran this inequality seminar series. And one of the things I thought was really fascinating was a speaker who came in and talked about priming. And she said, she'd gone on the job market twice. The first time, she got no offers and no interviews. And the second time, with exactly the same CV and research, like nothing had changed in a year, she had done this thing beforehand where she had written about a time when she felt like she had power. And so she primed herself to feel like she had power and gone into the interviews like that. And then she had gotten all of these job offers. And I think about that all the time with the ways in which people of color are disempowered, right, in real life. We're primed constantly for disempowerment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then to get into a workshop with already that priming and to face more disempowerment just by the structure, even like unintended disempowerment, structural disempowerment, it can make it really hard to, right, like have faith in your writing, to even like be able to sort good advice from bad advice, to, feel like you have some kind of ownership over your own story. All those things seem really important as a piece of what you need to get through a workshop. And those things are kind of just like structurally diminished as tools that are available to us.
Yeah. And as part of this rethinking or reseeing stories, you offered some redefinitions of certain terms that we take for granted, like tone, conflict, characterization, story arc, and all these things. I find it really interesting, especially with conflict and plot, because that you keep going back to Aristotle and how important,
Right.
and Ian Foster. And one thing about the book is how exhaustive, the references, you go back to all these books, about craft and writing and all that, and you take them on, point by point on these important definitions. I like the one about conflict in particular, because you kind of make us look at conflict from different lenses. Different cultures view conflict in different ways. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like different cultures, like Asian cultures, the idea of conflict and consensus are totally different from, or confrontation, different from what a Western reader might think.
Yeah, so one of the differences I talk about in the book is the way of structuring a novel through, also started in poetry, Kisho Tenketsu, which is this 4-part structure. It doesn't necessarily involve conflict. It involves, instead of that, a twist. And the twist is really interesting in that it's not really necessarily a plot twist. It's like a twist in the understanding of the book. And I see this all the time, actually. I'm teaching this course right now. I've called it like Making and Unmaking. And one of the books we read is Earthlings. And in Earthlings, it's this young woman who believes that she is an alien, and we kind of go through the book thinking, right, like she's just maybe has some kind of childish belief in this, and then the book eventually starts to kind of change your perception of whether or not what's possible in the world, and by the end of it, I hate to like ruin it, but it's like there's like murder and cannibalism and like shared pregnancy, male pregnancy, and it becomes a completely different book. And there's this way in which, there's some conflict because people do get murdered, right? But it's almost like secondary to the way in which the book is compelling, right? The compellingness comes from the way in which you're kind of like rethinking how to read the book. It's something that I really like as a possibility for how to think about conflict. But we don't, I think, part of why we think conflict is so kind of like win, lose, or draw is this like emphasis on teleology and this kind of like hyper masculine conquering thing, right? Like we have to conquer it, or we're going to lose to it, or like the only options are this kind of like war options, right?
Yeah.
And if we just kind of stop thinking about it as like something has to happen to finish the conflict by the end of the book, some of the short stories I love, contemporary stories I love are like, even with conflict coming in, kind of set it up the conflict and then disappear. The story kind of ends before we ever get to what could happen with the conflict. And you just kind of think this story opens the door to all of these different possibilities. And I actually like thinking of storytelling like that. Like, what is a story that instead of like uses conflict to close down the possibilities, just kind of opens things up.
Exactly. And of course, different cultures, the emphasis is some cultures is more on consensus instead of conflict.
Right.
This
Right.
like communal culture they're more about consensus instead of confrontation. One thing I noticed that you haven't said a lot about in the book is the function of publishing. Maybe that's not part of but what do you think of that in terms, if we're looking at stories and power and who gets to tell stories?
Yeah.
Publishing is, of course, the gatekeepers. And
right.
What do you think of that? And people of color, of course, within the whole context of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Like if we don't have the options to read from, then of course we can't kind of build a new understanding of what stories can be. I think it's a huge problem. I just didn't really feel, as you say, right, there's a lot of kind of references and research that went into the book, and I didn't feel like I had as good of an understanding. If anybody has an understanding of publishing, sometimes it doesn't even seem like publishers have a good understanding of how publishing works. But I think you're absolutely right that like, right, it starts on some level from just like hiring more editors of color, having those editors, a lot of the rejections I got for my second book were, I love this book, but I don't know how to sell it, right? Which is, this is like, I like this, but I don't think that there's an audience for this book. I can't imagine the audience for this book, right? Which I actually don't even resent now. There was a time when I did resent that, but now I think, well, yeah, of course, that's the editor's job, right? To understand how to pitch a book to an audience, right? There's this kind of the gatekeeper between the audience and the author. And it just means probably we need, first of all, editors to think, more broadly about audience, but also like just more editors from diverse backgrounds who can kind of think about diverse audiences, right? And if we kind of just keep hiring the same kind of people, then of course the books will keep being published and aimed for the same audiences.
Yeah, we're getting to the 40-minute mark, and I know that we will soon have to take questions from audiences. I don't know if we have enough questions to start that, or we just keep going.
You have one in the. Do you see that one, Helon? if you click ask a question.
Okay. Here it is. Let me read it out. After reading Namli, where he struggles with whether to write the ethnic story, one of the most uncomfortable aspects of workshop has been when this authority is questioned. When a writer includes or writes from a perspective outside of their identity, as a person of color, am I enabling this culture of fulfilling the expectations to only tell stories about cultural identity? Are we self-limiting ourselves to tell ethnic stories, as Lee writes, because we are seen as the only people who can? This is from Kathleen Culver.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think there was a time when I worried a lot about this too, but part of it is thinking of like stories about people of color as the only stories that are stories about identity, right? Where stories about white characters are all about identity and about the identity of whiteness and the privilege that the characters have. It's just that the authors don't really acknowledge that, right? And so I think we're uniquely situated, maybe, or people kind of who have been marginalized in various ways are situated in a way in which they're able to be aware of and include the marginalization in how they are understanding a character's identity. But I also think, you know, we should all do that, and and we should all acknowledge that, and we should all understand, right, that a white character is a white character, right, not just a kind of universal human being. And so I don't think we're limiting ourselves. I think, you know, actually, it's more limiting to think, let's leave off the table this thing that is, right, like extremely important to how we live our lives and how everybody interacts with us and how we interact with people, and how we understand ourselves and how we understand other people. That seems more limiting to me.
Yeah, good point. You talked a lot about naming the race of characters in your in workshops, how people, you know, expect, right? I mean, characters of color to be identified.
Right.
You say that going forward, you decided to name every character in your stories. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I thought, you know, one of the things I found really interesting in my MFA was there was a moment in a workshop where a student said, this author keeps like describing every single character as soon as they enter the page. Why does he do that? And then the professor said, well, like that's always what we do, right? And it was this kind of moment of shaming, but it was also for a lot of us, I think, like, oh yeah, that's true, right? Well, we didn't realize it until it was pointed out. Actually, like I was in the same position. I could have said the same thing if I hadn't heard somebody else say it first. And like one of the things we immediately notice when we notice somebody is race, right? Like I think that it's impossible not to notice that, and the people who say they don't, right, are have their own problems. And so I just wanted to kind of incorporate that in the way that we describe people, you know, instead of just like the color of their hair or the clothes that they're wearing, which often don't even, you know, register the clothes that people are wearing until a little bit later. It takes, you know, I'm so focused on like face and, you know, like stuff like that race is like a really primary thing that we notice. Gender, ability, right? Like these things are really important to us. Class, whether we're kind of consciously noticing them or not, that says more about the character noticing, right, than the character is being noticed.
Exactly. And sometimes, you know, it's almost as if the race itself is the character.
Yeah.
Instead of just describing, you know, what makes the person they are. It's not the race. It's whatever they do or whatever they. But yeah, that's
yeah. When you only name the race of some characters, it does make it seem that way, right? Like
yeah,
these are characters, but then this is the Black character, the Asian character. Like that's who they
that's
are.
it. That's it. That's
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
There are questions popping up now, Helon, if you want to address some of those.
Okay. Let me see. your workshop process are so compelling, would you use them in intro to creative writing classes as well as upper level workshops? Is there any value in rooting students in the traditional workshop format, or should we be forging ahead in a way that empowers young writers' voices from the very beginning of these courses?
It seems like that question kind of answers itself. Should we not be empowering them? I think we should be empowering them. The advantage, I think, of teaching the traditional workshop is if we think students are going to have to encounter this later, that we can prepare them in some way for that encounter. But that seems pretty outweighed by empowering young writers' voices from the beginning of these courses. I do a kind of mix in the intro courses where I'll do the strict CRP, so that students have a sense of like what those stages are. They can see, they can kind of have control over exactly what stage they're in and understand like the boundaries around that, which I think is really helpful for intro students because they're often like desperate for somebody to just tell them like, just do X, Y, and Z, right? Like if I just know what these X, Y, and Z things are, then it'll help me think about other things, right? The same way we talk about like reading a book over and over again. And then later we start to do different things in workshop. But I don't kind of get into these, some of the workshop methods that are more out of the or more tailored to individual writers and stories. I'm doing that all the time in grad workshops, like kind of working undergrads up to it.
Thanks. Here's another question. It says, can you talk about encountering student resistance to new workshop models? I started using the CRP after reading your book, and it seemed students were so used to the traditional method that they were skeptical about it at first. How do you address that in the classroom?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sometimes I think a course is all about what you do in like the first 2 weeks, like how you position the course, and how you contextualize it. I spend like way too long, versus my preferences, talking through the syllabus and talking about what the course will be like, what students can expect from the course. Trying to break down expectations from other courses, talking about what courses, other courses are like. And I think that helps a lot later in the course where we do things that are different from their expectations because they already have a sense that we're going to do that, right? And so that helps. The other part, it's like trying to empower the students to do that. Even just kind of laying out the options, maybe asking students what they would want to do. I think probably you would find students would want to do CRP if you kind of explain what that process was like and the reasons for why to do it. And then being responsible for their own decision, right, like helps too to empower them within that method. And there are also kind of points where I try to talk to them about the ways in which the workshop is different from a literature course. Right? And I think we do this all the time, and like when we're trying to switch the conversation from like literary criticism to craft, which I think is a huge thing that teachers have to do in intro courses, right? It's like this constant trying to push the conversation to craft. It's also something that you can do around workshop, right? Trying to kind of like constantly challenge those ways in which they've already been kind of the received ways in which they think something's supposed to be talked about.
Here's another one. What advice would you give someone who teaches introduction to creative? Okay. What advice would you give to someone who teaches introduction to creative writing, who may bring her own baggage about workshops to the classroom, but is leading students who may have no preconceptions at all about how workshop functions?
Yeah, it'd be great if they didn't have preconceptions. The thing that I found though is like it's so much in the culture now, right? Like it's on Girls. I've never seen that show, but I've heard that there's workshops in that show. It's like people have this idea already about what the workshop will be like before they're even in a workshop now. So I don't know if that's ever a thing where you can kind of get away from the preconceptions. But the advice, I love teaching those intro courses just because like everything is new, right? And everything is setting expectations for them and like doing the work of I think it's much easier to do the work of giving them a sense that there are multiple directions to go from the beginning than having to break down their sense later that there's only one way to do things and try to like help them move backward into that sense that there are multiple ways of doing things. I actually think often my students kind of come in thinking of that there are different ways of doing things, and then like the more workshops they go through, they start to think this is what, or they'll say like, oh, this is what this other professor said fiction is supposed to do. And I'll say, I don't want to like, like contradict that, but what do you think? Yeah, right. What do you think? The way that I usually approach those intro courses is through trying to like get some kind of shared language. I actually like the way that Felicia Rose Chavez does it too in her book. She kind of chooses a shared language for the class, so the class kind of comes up with a shared language on its own. I've been doing more of like trying to prepare them for the language that they might get in other classes, but I think a lot of what helps them to move into the conversational mode is to understand the terms, right, and to kind of get a sense that they have ownership over even the kind of lingo.
Mm-hmm. To go back to the book, the idea of standardization, you keep coming back to that. And one thing, I think the example you gave is how most teachers of creative writing, they teach based on what they were taught. And basically this keeps repeating itself. And then we have this standardization, and it affects the way we write, basically, because this is what is expected. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, the standardization? And
yeah, and we think of it as so innocent, I think is the interesting thing, right? Like, so in the book I talk to you about like the way in which like the kind of minimalism was established as this right ideal form. Part of that is standardization, right? Like it's easy to standardize, it's easy to teach, right? It's easy to teach cutting out adverbs and right, like doing less adverbs, less adjectives, simple language, right? There are these like rules that are easily applicable. The ways in which we kind of standardize things through kind of like the lore, talking to other teachers or doing what we've been taught, is pretty different from how it seems to work in other disciplines where people have more resources just about like the different ways other people have taught classes and they've built on those resources. And that's part of what I was trying to do with the book was not to kind of like erase the books that are out there, which are there are books out there, but very few, but to kind of like continue to build up a foundation upon which to like bring in new thoughts that might be outside of the norms. I think like the amount of experimenting we do in our writing, the amount of time we spent trying to do things that are new and interesting to us, we can do that in the classroom too, right? Like you don't have to experiment only with your own work, right? Experiment in the classroom. That's how I felt like I was getting to be a better teacher or getting to have more control over the classroom and how to help students better was just by kind of trying out new things. And I think like if we can move first away from a model in which everything is the same for every student, then we'll just be able to kind of improve ourselves just by experimenting the same way we do with fiction when we're writing it.
Great. So advice do you give your students, in preparing to become teachers, in preparing to become writers, and basically, citizens, right?
Yeah,
What's the best advice you give them?
that's good. I guess my best advice is this is advice that a mentor gave me in my PhD program, that like you never want to think you know something completely, right?
Mhm.
You never want to stop kind of learning and improving, because as soon as you think that knowledge is like something you can hold on to, the knowledge is dead for you, right? Like that thing is dead, and you kind of keep it alive by continuing to improve and adapt and learn new things. So I'm always trying to, instill that kind of active revision,
Mhm.
as a like a life aesthetic, not only as a kind of like work aesthetic.
Mhm. Do you introduce a lot of texts from other cultures in your classroom, and does it help?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do, and does it help is a really good question. I don't. Yeah, I think it does, but not as much as I would like, maybe, because, and I read a little bit about this in the book, but it right, like I'm not teaching in a bubble. I'm teaching amongst everybody else who's teaching, and so when they're getting those works only in my class, and I'm trying to like provide a large breadth of different kinds of readings, but they don't get that in other classes. The things that I'm giving them then seem like exceptions to a rule, or like the weird story, right? Like the stories that are so strange. Um, and there's a way in which that's nice. Like stories, I like strange stories, um, but what they need more of probably is like the foundation through which to understand those stories as like one in a line, right? One in its own tradition. Um, and I can't give them that in one class.
Yeah.
And so I do find it that it's helpful in some ways, because it's kind of broadening their sense of what fiction can be. But in other ways, it's not kind of deepening their understanding of what fiction can be. And I wish I could do both at the same time somehow.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the point is to make people understand that fiction is just is more complex and it's diverse, and it can do more than one thing, and there are different traditions and different ways of writing. I try to introduce different authors too, but I find that I spend a lot of time trying to explain,
Yeah.
which is a good thing. It's a good thing, to explain where that story is coming from and the traditions behind that storytelling and all of that.
Right.
Again,
A hard thing to do in 5 to 10 minutes.
yeah, it's very hard. Just to remind our audience that this is, the book, Craft in the Real World. It's really, really a great read, and it's going to change the way you look at the creative writing workshop and even storytelling itself. I cannot emphasize that enough. I have an example that you used from Jen, what you brought up earlier about how she described this teapot
Yeah.
from her family. What makes the teapot valuable to her is how old it is, and the flavors is kind of accumulated over time with use over time, and how the flavor is kind of enhanced because of that from that culture. Whereas in a different culture, what makes the teapot valuable is because it's shiny and new.
Right.
That's a very, very interesting analogy.
Yeah, you could think like a cast iron pan too. That like
Yeah,
the
yeah,
person who like cleans it all off. This is like a disaster for the one who's been using it for so long and built up all those flavors.
yeah. Well, Matthew, it's been a pleasure
Thank you so much. Thank you,
conversation
Helon.
with you. And please, people, get this book. It's going to change the way you look at the workshop. Believe me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Great advice, great insight during this last hour together. But another thing that I love about this book so much are the practical exercises that teachers of writing can look at and implement in the classroom, like literally tomorrow. So thanks for including those really practical exercises as well, Matthew.
Yeah, absolutely. Writers too. Just
yeah, for sure.
You can do it yourself.
Yeah.
Thanks for everyone for watching. Please consider buying Craft in the Real World from your local independent bookseller, or by using the link provided on vabook.org. You can also check out other events at the 2022 Virginia Book Festival at vabook.org. I'm Greg Wilhelm, Director of Mason Creative Writing. Thanks so much, and let's give a round of virtual applause to Matthew and Helon. What a great conversation. Thanks so much, gentlemen.
Yeah.
Enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of the Virginia Festival of the Book. Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye.